Sarah Walsh knew from childhood that she wanted to live in a big city, lead an active life, and never stop there. She liked it when everything around was seething, ringing, flashing with colors and events. From an early age, she demonstrated a talent for languages and public speaking, surprising those around her with her mature prudence and excellent sense of style. Originally from a small town in Kansas, she always dreamed of breaking out of her usual routine. When she was 19 years old, she moved to New York to attend university. There she met many ambitious people, among whom was her future husband Mark Rivers. Mark was 2 years older than Sarah, studied at the Faculty of Business, and even then showed incredible determination. He aspired to found his own company, or, at a minimum, to get into the top management echelon of one of the large holdings. He was interested in everything related to investments, risk management, global markets, and financial transactions. Despite the huge amount of studying, he knew how to find time for volunteer projects, communication with friends, and, of course, dates. It was at one of the university events dedicated to young entrepreneurs that their paths crossed. Sarah represented a student organization that was involved in social initiatives and supporting low-income communities. That evening, Mark was making a presentation about his own startup, a small consulting firm that he launched with two friends. Sarah liked his confidence, politeness, and the way he looked into the other person's eyes when he spoke. Mark, for his part, was fascinated by the way Sarah laughed at his jokes while speaking seriously about issues of social injustice. They began a relationship that, at first glance, was ideal and based on mutual respect. After 3 years of marriage, when Sarah was 22 and Mark was 24, they got married. The wedding was kept small, inviting only close friends and relatives. Sarah's parents and Mark's parents finally met, and despite the obvious differences in background and upbringing, everyone was happy with this union. Over the years, Mark's career began to gain momentum. He rose to the position of vice president at a respected financial company, and then, thanks to a risky but successful project, he was able to found his own investment fund. Sarah found herself in the field of marketing and brand management. She became a leading specialist in an advertising agency, where she promoted large fashion houses and cosmetics brands. Thanks to her sense of taste, charisma, and organizational skills, Sarah quickly gained the authority and respect of her colleagues. However, the more successful the Rivers family became, the less time husband and wife spent together. Everyone had business trips, meetings, reports, and evening events. At first, their communication was limited to funny SMS messages and short calls throughout the day, but then this began to fade away. Sarah increasingly found herself in an empty house, looking at the clock and wondering where Mark was now and why they so rarely had private evenings. In their new home, a stylish townhouse in one of the prestigious areas of the city, they spent almost no time together, although they once dreamed of a large living room and a cozy fireplace. Mark spent time in the office and in negotiations, trying to develop business and strengthen connections with influential people. Sarah also kept up with her work, but at some point she felt that, despite her success, an emptiness had settled in her soul. She realized with alarm that her husband was moving away. She lacked attention, she missed unexpected gifts, joint trips to nature, and simple human communication. Gradually, Sarah began to think that the very spark that they had once so carefully supported had disappeared in their relationship. To cope with stress, Sarah decided to take care of herself and her appearance. She began going to spas and beauty salons more often, buying new clothes, and also signed up for an elite sports club not far from the office. She thought that sports would help maintain not only physical fitness, but also morale. It was there that she first noticed how many attractive, confident people there were around. She became curious about how they lived, what they talked about, what kind of family relationships they had. But what struck her most was how often she began to receive attention. Initially, Sarah perceived all this as light flirting, without any intention of going further. Friends and relatives, outwardly seeing the luxurious life of the couple, believed that everything was perfect for Sarah and Mark. After all, in photographs on social networks, they were smiling, traveling, attending exhibitions and presentations. No one suspected that behind this happy picture lay a deep emotional abyss. Sarah became withdrawn, sometimes crying in the evenings when Mark did not return home until late at night. On rare days off, he was so exhausted from negotiations that he preferred to sleep off rather than spend time with his wife. The general illusion of prosperity hid the emerging crisis. So several tense months passed. Sarah tried for a long time to talk directly with her husband about how she missed his presence, his attention, and general closeness. But Mark, not wanting to listen to reproaches, or perhaps not realizing the scale of her problems, brushed it off, promising that an important project is about to end, and then we will have more time for each other. Days passed, months gave way to regular reporting periods, but the situation remained the same. The point of no return for Sarah came when, on their wedding anniversary, a milestone she had pinned her hopes on, Mark never returned for dinner. He wrote to her that, urgent matters again, sorry, and I'll try not to be late, but I can't promise. Sarah sat alone at the set table, remembering their first meeting, their jokes, their life, which seemed so filled with happiness in the past. At that moment, she felt that the world under her feet was beginning to shake. It was after that evening that she began to really think that perhaps she and Mark no longer had a future as a classic happy couple. Plunging into a depressed state, Sarah at first did not understand how to decide on something new and unexpected. However, it was then that the realization came to her that without a change of scenery, she would simply wither within these walls, leaving life to take its course. She once again signed up for training, but this time not just to keep in shape, but to take her mind off obsessive thoughts about the collapse of her family. She wanted to experience something bright, different from her usual routine. With this feeling, she entered an elite fitness club early in the morning, expecting another session of cardio and stretching. And that's when she saw Jason, a young, energetic, and friendly trainer who worked with clients in individual sessions. As it turned out, he had only recently moved here from another establishment and was already earning a good reputation among visitors. The next day, waking up with a heavy heart and the same feeling of emptiness, Sarah left the house a little earlier than usual. She wanted to do a few rounds on the treadmill before the workday started. She again went to the sports club, which she had recently tried not to neglect, believing that at least physical activity could bring some kind of harmony to her condition. Entering the hall, Sarah saw that there were not too many people at such an early time. Calm, muted music was playing, several people were doing yoga in the corner, and someone was warming up on the mat. In general, the situation was conducive to concentration. The woman noted to herself that she loves this particular time of day for exercising. The to-do list has not yet accumulated in her head, and she can allow herself to slightly forget about the work routine. She went to the counter to get a towel and suddenly heard a cheerful voice behind her. "Good morning. You are earlier today than yesterday, right?" Turning around, Sarah saw Jason. He was wearing a club t-shirt with a special logo, emphasizing his athletic physique. He looked about 25 years old, no more, and there was something bright and sunny in his appearance. As if he had no problems, he lived life to the fullest and enjoyed his work. "Yes, I decided to run in front of the office," Sarah answered, feeling her cheeks slightly reddening. She usually didn't get embarrassed so quickly, but something about this guy affected her in an unexpected way. Perhaps it was the fact that he smiled openly, in a friendly way, not like the suited financial analysts she was used to seeing around her husband. "Great idea. I'm Jason, by the way," he introduced himself. "I'll be happy to help if you have any questions. Or if you would like personal training, please contact us. Always here from morning to evening." He nodded energetically, as if assuring that he was really ready to help everyone. "I'm Sarah, nice to meet you. Maybe I'll really sign up someday," she said, accepting the towel handed to her by the coach. It seemed to her that their gazes crossed a little longer than was appropriate for ordinary business communication. Jason must have felt something similar because he tilted his head slightly and smiled again before walking away to join the group of visitors. Sarah sat on the exercise bike, trying to distract herself from the sudden rush of thoughts. Just a couple of phrases, but a strange excitement ignited in her. And it wasn't just Jason's attractiveness, although it would be stupid to deny it. Rather, it was the very fact that, in fact, they paid attention to her sincerely and with interest, and how she responded to this interest, albeit politely, but with some hint of further communication. During the entire 20 minutes on the exercise bike, Sarah replayed their short conversation in her head. When she finished and went to the free weights area, she saw Jason showing a couple of girls the proper technique for doing squats. Trying to remain calm, Sarah focused on her training, but was glad that she occasionally caught Jason's eye on her. Then she suddenly remembered her youth when she was not yet burdened with marriage, family obligations, and many social roles. When you could flirt freely, go on dates, laugh at trifles, without worrying about serious consequences. Returning home and getting ready for work, Sarah noted that for the first time in a long time, she felt something akin to high spirits. And although she did not intend to go into any meaningful intrigue, this new feeling haunted her all day. She remembered Jason's smile, how natural he looked. She wanted to ask him about how he chose the profession of a fitness trainer, what his hobbies were, and what was important to him. The feeling of guilt because of such thoughts was knocking on her mind. What about Mark? Is it possible to be so worried about another man, even if it's just flirting? But another part of Sarah stubbornly objected. Mark spends a lot of time working and doesn't notice me. Don't I deserve a little attention from the outside? The next day, she again found herself in the same sports club. After half an hour on the treadmill, Sarah went to the mirrors near the stretching area to warm up a little. At that moment, Jason approached her. He greeted her, asked how the training was going, and asked if she needed any recommendations. Sarah smiled and nodded. I don't mind, she said. But to be honest, I always studied on my own, without a coach. I'm not sure I can get used to the fact that someone is watching me, correcting me. She stopped short, realizing that the conversation was taking a more personal tone. You know, Jason responded, when people come to the gym, everyone has different goals. Some want to lose weight, some, on the contrary, gain muscle mass, and some just want to relieve stress. But not everyone understands how to competently build a program so as not to overtrain and harm the body. If you want, we can conduct a test. We will determine your level, flexibility, and general physical fitness. It's free and takes 15-20 minutes, and then decide whether you need a full-time lesson with me. Sarah suddenly felt that her interest in Jason went beyond mere sympathy. She didn't want to push him away with her coldness, and at the same time, she struggled with doubt. After all, this can lead further than just training. Am I looking for casual flirtation or trying to fill my emotional emptiness? After hesitating, Sarah agreed. Okay, why not? She said, as if to herself. When do you have time for this assessment? Right now, if you have already completed your warm-up. Free for the next half hour, while another client is delayed, Jason answered, and there was joyful excitement in his voice. Thus took place the first official session, in which Jason asked Sarah to perform a series of exercises: squats, push-ups, stretching, light sets with free weights. He behaved professionally, not making inappropriate comments, and at the same time communicated with her in a friendly manner, maintaining a conversation about her lifestyle, nutrition, and daily routine. Sarah noted that he was really interested in listening to how she spends her time, what difficulties she faced at work, and how she tries to combine her career with her personal life. And if at first she answered briefly, trying not to reveal details, then she began to talk a little more, realizing that for some reason she was pleased. At the end of the session, as they were debriefing and discussing what to focus on, Sarah suddenly noticed that Jason's hands were shaking slightly as he handed her a bottle of water. She looked at his face and saw that he was looking at her intently. There was excitement in the eyes, maybe interest, or maybe nascent infatuation. At that moment, Sarah remembered her youth. Those carefree parties, when everything was new, unusual, and she could afford to fall in love at least 5 times a week. Now she is married to Mark, with whom she shares a house and, in fact, life. But the feeling she felt next to Jason awakened something alive inside her, long dormant under the weight of problems and disagreements with her husband. You did great, Jason finally said, a little hoarsely, as if he had gained the courage to say something secret. You have good stamina, and it seems to me you are a very purposeful person. I hope we will work out together again more than once. I would be pleased to become your permanent coach if you want." Sarah looked down to hide her blush and smile. "What am I doing?" flashed through her head. "I guess I just want the attention I don't get at home." But then she thought, why not? It's just training. Nothing bad. And at the same time, I felt that deep down I had already begun to allow myself to dream of something more. They agreed on regular classes twice a week. Jason suggested that she write down a diet and exercise plan that fit her lifestyle and discuss it in the next session. Sarah agreed, trying not to betray the excited state that gripped her soul. As she left the hall, she caught a glimpse of her own reflection in the mirror. A thin figure, an expensive tracksuit, neatly collected dark hair. She looked a little confused, but there was a light in her eyes that had been missing for a long time. The one that appears when interest or attraction arises in the soul. The rest of the day at work passed for Sarah in a blur. She looked at the spreadsheets and marketing reports, but what she saw in her mind was the scene of her morning workout. She thought about how smoothly and naturally he touched her shoulder, showing the correct position of her body, and about how he asked about her goals, interests, and hobbies. Sarah felt a surge of strength and inspiration that even her colleagues noticed her unexpectedly good mood. A friend from work, Maria, with whom Sarah had a relatively confidential relationship, asked in surprise, "You're absolutely shining today. Did something happen?" Sarah hesitated before answering. What could she say? Tell me about a young sports coach to whom he confesses his problems. This is unlikely to be appropriate. Finally, she said, "No, I just slept well and the morning workout was beneficial." She shrugged with a grin. "Perhaps I'll start going to the club more often." Maria nodded, noticing a certain amount of slyness, but did not ask questions. It was enough for her to see that Sarah was inspired by something. That evening, Sarah returned home, expecting to see Mark. She was determined to try to talk to him more gently, without reproaches, to suggest going out somewhere on the weekend, maybe going to a wine tasting or a fancy restaurant together. However, all that awaited her at home was a short sticker on the refrigerator, written in Mark's handwriting. "Sorry, I'm late at work, important deal. I'll be there by midnight. Have dinner without me. I love it. M." Sarah sighed, feeling the familiar disappointment. "I love," she thought with bitter irony. "I wonder what remains of this love if he constantly disappears from our house. Or am I too demanding?" She sat on the sofa, mechanically scrolling through the news feed on her phone. She said in a low voice, as if to herself, "To hell with everything," and turned off the phone. After all, in the evening, there was no longer any need to pretend to be a good wife who was happily waiting for her husband. This time she felt that her soul was no longer suffering from Mark's absence as much as before. She didn't even care a little, or rather, an internal protest continued to smolder within her. "If you don't notice me, then maybe someone else will." Jason's smiling face flashed in his head, and this thought was both frightening and pleasant. The next 2 weeks passed almost the same. Every morning Sarah woke up, went to the sports club, and spent an hour and a half there in the company of Jason. He gave her different exercises, made sure she was breathing properly, talked about his goals. It seemed that he also wanted to develop and plan to open his own personal fitness studio. In between approaches, they managed to exchange phrases about life and hobbies. It turned out that Jason loved surfing, and last year he went to Florida for several months to learn new skills in the waves of the Atlantic. He also admitted that he grew up in a small town somewhere in the Midwest and moved to New York for the opportunity and excitement, because where I came from was too boring. The situation with Mark, in turn, worsened. He stayed late and left before Sarah had time to wake up, which is why they practically did not communicate. In the rare moments when he did show up at home on time, Sarah felt unusually awkward. They had nothing to talk about except conventional phrases about work and finances. There was almost no talk about their joint plans for the future. It seemed that everyone was isolated in their own world, away from the other. And maybe it was just a matter of time before one of them decided to say out loud that the family was falling apart at the seams. The unexpected meeting, which took place as if by chance, radically changed Sarah. She radiated energy that was noticed by her colleagues and acquaintances. At work, she began to take more initiative, generate new ideas, and participate in negotiations with clients. She wanted to live and feel as if youth were returning to her again. It was as if her enthusiasm waned around Mark, but around Jason it blossomed. Of course, there were still moments when Sarah's guilt returned, especially when Mark, spending another evening at home, took a minute to look into the bedroom, smile at her, and, it seems, sincerely ask, "How are you doing? How's work?" But he quickly interrupted this moment with a story about the need for an urgent call to partners or news on the stock exchange, and again went to his office. Sarah, barely having time to regain her spirit, was again drowning in the feeling of her uselessness. But in the beginning, we were united and inspired each other. A bitter thought flashed. From the moment Sarah began working out with Jason at an elite fitness club, her life seemed to have acquired a new rhythm. Every weekday, at exactly 7 in the morning, she entered a spacious hall, where the morning twilight was diluted by soft lighting, and encouraging music quietly sounded in her headphones. But the main thing was the feeling that covered her when she saw Jason in the coach's signature t-shirt. He invariably greeted her with a friendly smile and an inquisitive look, each time rejoicing at her arrival, as if she were the only visitor to the gym. Gradually, their short business conversations grew into something more personal. They began to discuss their past longer, share plans, and even joke. It seemed to Sarah that next to him she again felt like a young and cheerful girl who could handle anything. However, an atmosphere that went beyond friendly flirting had long hovered between them. Every time Jason adjusted her arm during a stretch or showed her how to hold her back correctly, Sarah found herself breathless. She felt a trembling excitement from his touch, as if an invisible electric discharge passed through her entire body. Such a reaction was new to her, because in her marriage to Mark such feelings gradually faded away. But something kept them both from taking the decisive step, perhaps an awareness of the consequences or a banal fear of breaking all the rules. One day after training, when the gym was almost empty, Jason suggested that Sarah stay a little longer and do an additional set of stretching and muscle relaxation exercises. She hesitated because she had to arrive at the office on time, but the desire to stay grew inside her. She looked at her watch and decided to take a chance after all. She could get to work faster by taxi. The lesson lasted for a full hour and a half. They moved to a separate small room located in the back of the sports club, where personal yoga classes were usually held. A soft rug, twilight, calm music, and the almost complete absence of other people created an atmosphere of solitude. At first, everything went as usual. Jason showed the exercises, Sarah repeated them. He then suggested the practice of couples stretching, where the trainer helps the client gradually but deeply reach into the floor or legs. As Jason gently grabbed Sarah's waist, holding her in a forward-leaning position, she felt his breath touch her neck. It gave her goosebumps. She couldn't look away. Her heart started beating faster. "Relax," he whispered, noticing the tension in her shoulders. "I'm nearby. Just breathe and relax." Sarah obediently closed her eyes and took several deep breaths. But it was difficult for her to ignore the fact that Jason's young and strong body was literally a few centimeters from her own. When he finally helped her return to her original position, they accidentally met their eyes, and a spark seemed to jump between them. It seemed to Sarah that everything around her quiet music, soft light served as a backdrop for the inevitable. They froze for a moment, as if checking whether one would allow the other to cross the line. In the end, it was Jason who made the decision first. He slowly leaned in, and their lips touched. This kiss was not timid or crumpled. It was an intense, deep fusion of long-awaited desires that they both seemed to be desperately resisting until that moment. Sarah felt dizzy, and with some desperate courage, she responded to his kiss, feeling with her whole body that she was being overwhelmed by a wave of passion that she had not experienced in marriage for a long time. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't," Jason muttered, pulling away slightly, but his voice sounded hoarse and unsure, as if he knew it was too late to stop. Sarah didn't answer. She took the next step herself, pressing herself against him again. In that tiny space where twilight reigned, they seemed to lose all sense of reality. Jason's hands slid around her waist, moving higher to her chest. Sarah shuddered from the surging wave of attraction. It became clear to her that this was not just a fleeting kiss, but something more. As if in some kind of dream, they moved to the wall where there were soft Pilates blocks and sports equipment. Sarah felt her body indulge in these sensations without resistance, and the thought pulsated in her head, I am crossing the forbidden line. But instead of fear, she experienced an amazing mixture of freedom and inner explosion. It seemed that at that moment she left all doubts and surrendered to a wave of passion. Their first sexual encounter took place right on the mat, amid the faint light falling from the corridor and quiet melodies playing from the speakers. Jason behaved alternately frantically and carefully, as if trying to guess all of Sarah's secret desires. Shame, anticipation, and incredible pleasure were mixed in her mind, from which everything inside was compressed. She realized that she had not experienced anything like this for a long time. Relationships with Mark in bed became formal and rare, having long ago lost their freshness. And then there was a hurricane of feelings, touches, hot kisses, and barely restrained moans. When it was all over, they lay next to each other for a long time, breathing heavily. A whole avalanche of thoughts fell on Sarah, from panic, what have I done? This is the end of my marriage, to the enveloping happiness, I'm alive again and feel like myself. Jason also looked confused and exhausted, but somehow happy. Looking at her, he said quietly, I'm sorry if I did something wrong, but I think I've wanted this for a long time. Sarah, clinging to him, smiled uncertainty. I wanted it myself. I don't blame you for anything. They quickly put themselves in order, having difficulty finding words to discuss what had happened. Sarah checked her watch and gasped, realizing that she had very little time left so as not to be late for an important meeting. Instantly panic came over her. However, Jason brought a slight note of calm, promising that he would take her by car if she wanted. Sarah agreed, and they slipped out of the club together, trying not to attract too much attention. As they drove, Sarah looked out the window, not knowing what to say. A storm of emotions was seething inside her. Awareness of her infidelity to Mark, joy from physical intimacy, excitement, and fear of possible consequences. Several times Jason glanced at her quickly, as if trying to see if she regretted what happened. Sarah wanted to reassure him, to say that she had no regrets, but the words got stuck somewhere in her throat. In the end, she only asked, let's not talk about this on the phone or write messages. What if Mark finds out somehow? I don't want any trouble. Jason nodded in agreement, although his face showed that he was worried about all this secrecy. When they arrived at Sarah's office building, she quickly kissed him on the cheek and walked out, trying not to turn around so as not to arouse suspicion from colleagues who might be nearby. Walking through the glass doors, the woman felt her cheeks burning and her heart pounding. She couldn't believe that just a few minutes ago she had given herself over to passion with an almost stranger, and even while she was married. But now they were both connected by a common secret that could either destroy her life or perhaps give her new sensations. Time will show. In the evening, returning home, Sarah found the usual emptiness. Mark had again left for an urgent meeting with his partners, and she, while still in a state of euphoria, suddenly felt growing irritation. This is what I have been deprived of all these years: intimacy, emotions, the feeling that they want me and see me as a person, she thought, mechanically eating dinner in front of the TV. The image of Jason was constantly in front of my eyes. He was younger, full of energy, and, more importantly, he looked at her as the most desirable woman. This thought literally made Sarah shiver. For the first time in a long time, her evening wasn't filled with disappointment or tears. On the contrary, she felt that life had suddenly acquired bright colors. Over the next few days, Sarah and Jason tried to be extremely careful. In the sports club, in front of strangers, they smiled at each other only as coach and client, discreetly discussing plans for training or exercise techniques. But as soon as they were alone in the locker room, in a corner of the hall where there were no cameras, or in Jason's car, parked in a secluded place, their passion flared up again. Each time it turned into a rush of hugs and kisses that could not be stopped. Thus began their secret relationship, which inevitably leads Sarah to new internal conflicts and promises even more secrecy. The very fact that she was lying to her husband made her feel remorse. But as soon as she remembered Mark's coldness, his eternal business trips and disinterest in her feelings, all guilt receded. She convinced herself, I have the right to happiness because he hasn't paid attention to me for a long time. Sometimes she wondered, what if Mark is cheating too? After all, I know little about his life outside the house. These thoughts made me feel anxious and bitter, but there was also some strange amount of relief. They say, then we're even. A couple of weeks after starting a secret affair with Jason, Sarah received an unexpected invitation from her husband. Mark asked her to go with him to a corporate event. This happened extremely rarely because usually he preferred to be there alone. Sarah was intrigued and perhaps even delighted. Maybe he really wants to pay attention to me. She decided that there was no point in refusing. In addition, such events were often held on a luxurious scale and could be a good reason to feel part of social life. That evening, she put on an elegant black dress, did her makeup, and tidied up her hair. When Mark saw her in the hallway, his eyes widened for a moment, as if he had a newfound appreciation for his wife's beauty. However, he quickly looked away and nodded. You look great. Let's go. Inwardly, Sarah felt a slight disappointment because she was expecting a greater compliment or a hint of intimacy, but apparently Mark was so accustomed to his busy life that he did not know how to express emotions. They got into the car and drove to a fashionable hotel where the banquet was being held. On the way, Mark spoke on the phone several times, discussing business matters with someone. Sarah silently looked out the window, lost in her own thoughts. At the hotel, they were met by waiters with glasses of champagne, and numerous people in elegant suits and evening dresses were already crowding around. It was a reception in honor of the launch of a new investment fund project, in which Mark was one of the key managing partners. Laughter, greetings, and the clinking of glasses were heard everywhere. Sarah felt a little alien in this environment, but she tried to remain confident and still knew how to look impressive at such events. At some point, while Mark went to discuss details with financial analysts, a tall man with a soft smile approached Sarah. He looked to be in his early 40s, dark hair, sparse gray strands at the temples, but at the same time he looked fit and well-groomed. His blue eyes sparkled with curiosity when he saw her. Good evening. You must be Mark's wife. I'm James Harris, his colleague. We just recently started working together. He introduced himself, holding out his hand. Sarah smiled back and noticed that there was something unusually charming in his manner of speaking, conducive to a confidential tone. Yes, I'm Sarah. It's very nice to meet you. As far as I know, Mark rarely brings home stories about his colleagues, so I'm sorry if I haven't heard anything about you, she replied. James tilted his head slightly. It's okay. I literally switched to their fund a couple of months ago. I used to do consulting, but I decided it was time for me to join the world of big investments. Sarah noted that his voice was quiet and calm, and his intonation did not have a drop of arrogance, characteristic of many top managers she had encountered. She suddenly became interested in what kind of person this was and why Mark decided to cooperate with him. Over the next 10 minutes, while they talked, she became increasingly convinced that James had a rare ability to conduct a dialogue. He listened to her carefully and asked precise questions. What do you do if it's not a secret? He asked when he and Sarah moved a little to the side so as not to disturb the others. I'm in the marketing field. I work as a brand manager in a large agency. We promote different companies, fashion houses. In general, it's a routine, Sarah shrugged, trying not to show her inner pride in her achievements. Sounds interesting. I have always believed that marketing is the art of persuasion. Not to mention a lot of creative approaches, he noted. I think in your case it fits perfectly with external data and, apparently, charisma. Sarah felt a slight blush. The praise from an unfamiliar, but clearly educated man flattered her. She suddenly realized that she had been missing normal communication for a long time, in which the interlocutor showed sincere interest in her thoughts, and did not just nod out of politeness. She even caught herself thinking that in his presence she felt calm confidence, as if she had met a kindred spirit. A little later, Mark joined them. He thanked James for some successful transaction and invited everyone to go to the banquet hall, where the waiters had already begun to serve the main course. At the table where the key partners and their companions sat, Sarah tried not to look at James too often, but she felt something stirring inside her every time he put down his fork or knife and glanced at her. He was polite, not too intrusive, but there was a calm charm in his manner of conversation. He seemed to be really interested in people and not just weaving in stock phrases. The evening passed quite quickly. Sarah even enjoyed spending time in the same company with Mark, who behaved somewhat more relaxed than at home, partly thanks to a few glasses of good wine. At the end of the event, as the guests began to leave, James approached Sarah and quietly asked, "Can I hope that we will see each other again at corporate meetings? Or maybe you'll have a moment for coffee in a work environment?" Sarah, slightly surprised by this question, replied, "Well, theoretically, why not? If schedules intersect." She paused and added, "It was nice talking to you." James smiled. "Me too. I hope we meet again." They exchanged business cards. The gesture was completely businesslike, but Sarah noticed a warm sparkle in James's eyes. It seemed to her that he wanted to make it clear. This business card was just an excuse, while the real goal was to continue acquaintance in an informal setting. When she and Mark returned home, Sarah was haunted by the thought of how dual her life had become. In the morning and afternoon, she could be overwhelmed by passion for Jason, and in the evening, she unexpectedly found sincere interest in communicating with her husband's colleague. Did this bother her? Partly yes, but at the same time, she felt that for the first time in many years, a whole world of male attention was forming around her, which she so lacked. A few days later, as Sarah was finishing her workday, she suddenly received a letter from James in her work email. He asked if she could help him with recommendations for choosing a marketing agency for a side project he was planning to launch. She smiled, thinking that this was most likely just an excuse to continue the dialogue, and I decided to answer that I was ready to discuss the details over a cup of coffee. So their first one-on-one meeting was set up. They met in a cozy coffee shop not far from the office, where there was a calm atmosphere, and the barista knew all the regular customers by sight. Sitting at a small table, Sarah listened carefully as James talked about his project. It was an internet platform dedicated to financial advice. James was going to invest part of his own funds in it, as well as attract outside investors. He needed smart marketing solutions to bring the product to market. At first, they only talked about this, but when the main questions were exhausted, the conversation turned into a personal direction. James admitted that he got divorced 3 years ago, and now his life consists mainly of work and occasional travel, which he likes to do alone. He mentioned that recently he felt the need to expand his circle of acquaintances because, in his words, "No success is worthwhile if you cannot share it with someone close." Sarah listened to his story and felt how she was captured by sympathy. He had a balance of depth and openness. He didn't complain about life or try to impress. This made the conversation with him seem truly sincere. When James asked about her family, Sarah answered cautiously, not wanting to go into too much detail, but still admitted that there was a crisis in her relationship with her husband. Sometimes, sometimes I just don't feel like we're together," she said, looking down at her cup of coffee. "We are like neighbors who share housing, but live different lives." James seemed to understand her mood. He did not ask intrusive questions and only lightly touched the back of her hand lying on the table. "Believe me, you are not alone in such experiences. If you ever want to talk, I will be happy to listen to you." This light touch sent a shiver through Sarah's body. She suddenly felt comfortable around him, but at the same time she was frightened by how quickly she opened up to practically a stranger. However, she did not remove her hand. This gesture filled her with warmth and a feeling of being understood. Sarah and James' first meetings together were filled with conversations and almost innocent walks. After work, they sometimes met in a park or in a small restaurant to continue chatting. James talked about his former family life, shared his thoughts about business and his hobbies. Sarah gradually became bolder, starting to talk about her own experiences, without, of course, going into the details of her affair with Jason. She felt differently with James than with the young coach. There was a more measured pace, more attention to her inner world, less frantic chemistry, but the depth of mutual understanding grew. One day, after dinner at a small Italian cafe, James asked Sarah to go to the car to show her some documents that could be useful in her work planning a marketing campaign. She agreed, and they went out into the street, where dusk had already fallen. The air was filled with freshness, and the occasional streetlight cast strange shadows on the sidewalk. Sarah felt a calm excitement. It seemed to her that this night could change something in their relationship. She had long ago learned to detect such premonitions. As they approached the car, they actually began to look at the printouts. James explained something about the target audience of the project and the mechanics of promotion. Sarah was interested both professionally and purely humanly. He brought an inspired look into the conversation, spoke as if he was in love with the idea of his startup. Suddenly, she realized that James was increasingly freezing and looking at her. There was a short pause between them, filled with electric tension, very similar to what she felt when she first became close to Jason. But this tension was of a different kind, quieter, subtler, deeply emotional. Sarah, James said her name with a slight hoarseness, which immediately betrayed his excitement. Forgive me if I cross the line. I know that you are married, and I don't want to create problems for you. But the way I feel when we're together, he sighed, I haven't felt that way for a long time. Maybe since my divorce I haven't allowed myself such emotions. Sarah felt her heart beat faster. She took a step forward, subconsciously wanting to figure out what was going on between them. The very realization that she already had a physical relationship with Jason suddenly hit her with a new wave of guilt. Am I really so confused that I'm getting involved in another relationship? She thought. But looking at James, seeing in him sincere emotion and trepidation, she could not bring herself to push him away. It seemed to her that there was something deeper here than just bodily passion. I I don't know what's going on. It's all very confusing, she said in a half-whisper, but I feel good next to you. If this is important to you, James replied, I am willing to respect any boundaries you set. I want to support you, share my thoughts with you. He didn't have time to finish. Sarah took another step and placed her hand on his cheek. The moment lasted an eternity as their gazes met in the darkness. Then she rose slightly on her tiptoes and kissed him. This kiss was quiet, gentle, almost timid, but filled with inner trepidation. And James answered her, warmly, with cautious delight, as if afraid to frighten away the magic of the moment. For Sarah, this was a new revelation. She understood that she was cheating on her husband for the second time, but now it was not just a flash of passion, but something deeply personal, associated with emotional intimacy. When they pulled away, they were both excited. I don't want to rush you, James whispered, putting his arm around her shoulders. But I will be happy if we can continue communicating. We already have something more than a business relationship. Sarah nodded, burying her face in his chest. For a moment, she became afraid of how quickly she had fallen victim to feelings and what a double life she was living. On the one hand, Jason with his genuine physical energy and ardor. On the other hand, James giving her confidential intimacy and understanding. And in the middle of all this is Mark, her legal husband, with whom she was connected through years of marriage and memories. Her heart sank with the realization of how complicated everything was, but part of her soul seemed to rejoice, blossoming from the realization that she had suddenly become the center of attraction for so many people. Soon the relationship with James began to take the form of secret dates. They didn't see each other every day, like Sarah saw Jason at the gym, but they found an excuse to cross paths several times a week. Sometimes it was a late dinner in a small restaurant outside the city, where they were unlikely to be met by acquaintances. Sometimes they rented a hotel room under the guise of business trips, although this did not happen often. In this secluded space, they talked for hours, sharing their most intimate things. Gradually, physical contact began to develop, from timid kisses to more passionate touches. However, it was the conversation that prevailed in their connection, the spiritual closeness that Sarah had not found in her own marriage for a long time. The first full-fledged intimate contact between Sarah and James happened on the day when he completed an important deal and decided to celebrate the success. They rented a small but cozy room in a boutique hotel. It seemed to Sarah that she was repeating the same sin as with Jason, but in a different key. When they were alone, she struggled with guilt and at the same time a deep desire to trust James. His touches were careful and sensitive. He studied her reactions, as if trying not to cause the slightest pain. Sarah felt that for the first time in a long time, not only physical satisfaction itself was important to her, but also the atmosphere in which it occurred. He seemed to read her mood, asking quiet questions, stopping if she needed to catch her breath. Everything inside her melted from this caring, which contrasted sharply with Mark's selfishness and Jason's unbridled ardor. She herself didn't notice how she completely surrendered to this moment, forgetting about the fear and resentment that had accumulated at home. When it was all over and they were lying next to each other, Sarah suddenly burst into tears. The tears flowed quietly, without sharp sobs, but she was ashamed, and she turned away so that James would not see it. He felt her condition and, pressing against her, quietly whispered, "Hey, it's okay. I'm here, and everything that happened between us is not a mistake for me." Sarah tried to pull herself together, but the tears came from somewhere deep inside. At that moment, she wanted to tell him about Jason, about her unhappy marriage, about her confusion. But she was afraid of losing his respect. She only said with difficulty, "It's very difficult. I don't want to hurt anyone, and I don't know what will happen next." James listened to her without interrupting, and then quietly answered, "I understand how difficult your situation is. I don't demand immediate decisions from you. Just know that I am with you both in joyful and difficult moments." Sarah looked up at him and saw that there was no condemnation in his eyes, only sympathy and love. Yes, perhaps this was the beginning of a real feeling that she was afraid to even name. But at that moment, she felt grateful to fate for the fact that there was a person capable of accepting her with all the contradictions and darkened sides of life. Sometimes at night, lying awake, Sarah was horrified by what she had done. It seemed to her that she was walking on the edge of a knife, and that at any moment something was going to collapse. She imagined what disastrous consequences could overtake her if her husband found out about these two relationships. She was frightened by the thought that she could lose everything: her family, her reputation, and even those men who were now not indifferent to her. But stopping seemed impossible. As if having escaped from the shackles of a dull life, she immediately threw herself into a pool of forbidden connections and could not return back. At the same time, she watched what was happening to Mark. In recent weeks, he had often been at home, even less than usual. However, the thought occurred to her, what if Mark is also dating someone? This guess was born from his absence and some snatches of conversations that she heard while he was talking on the phone. Sarah didn't know whether to be happy or not. Sometimes she caught herself with a contradictory desire. Maybe it would be better if he also had an affair, then we would have fewer mutual claims. And at the same time, fear persisted. What if he starts following her, hiring a private detective? She already had to carefully erase messages on her phone, hide receipts from hotels and dinners. At the same time, tension with Jason grew. He increasingly hinted that he missed spending time with her outside the gym. He wanted to go to the movies, have dinner at a restaurant, or even go out of town for the weekend. But Sarah was forced to come up with excuses every time to avoid appearing in public. She understood that if they were seen together, rumors might reach Mark, and colleagues from the sports club might suspect something was wrong. Besides, she had other meetings with James, and how could they be reconciled? Gradually, Jason began to show jealousy, although he did not directly know about the existence of his rival. Disappointment and even resentment sometimes showed in his gaze. Sarah felt that this situation could not last forever. One day, she found herself thinking that she was dreaming that Mark would go on a business trip for a while or simply disappear from sight, allowing her to figure out what she really wanted. And yet, being driven into a corner puts more and more pressure on her psyche. Every day she had to diligently lie to her husband, making up stories to explain why she came home late from work or what unexpected errands she had on the weekend. During lunch breaks, she began to linger in cafes more often, starting spontaneous conversations with attractive men who occupied neighboring tables. Sometimes it was limited to light flirting and exchanging phone numbers, but sometimes everything turned to more frank meetings, which Sarah could never even imagine. Bartenders, lawyers, acquaintances of acquaintances, she stopped distinguishing them by profession or age. The main goal was the adrenaline rush. With each new man, she hoped to find something special, something that was not there in the previous novel. At a certain moment, she was carried away by a sociable taxi driver who was giving her a ride home after a busy evening. Along the way, they started talking about music and travel. Sarah involuntarily noted to herself that no one had listened to her so carefully for a long time. When they stopped at her house, in the silence of the night street, she unexpectedly invited him to come in for a couple of minutes, a wording that concealed both a hint and a desire. The man was surprised, but did not refuse. They were both curious to break the routine. This episode broke out almost with lightning speed. They spent only a few hours together, knowing almost nothing about each other. But it seemed to Sarah that at that moment she had found a second wind. Partly she fled from the feeling that she was again suffocating within the family walls. Over time, such connections became more and more frequent. Sometimes she herself was frightened by the courage that had been revealed in her. After all, each new name required a disguise, thinking through an alibi when her husband or one of her acquaintances asked where she spent the evenings. She got confused in her own schemes, but passion won. As a result, Sarah began to keep a separate diary with notes about where and at what time the meeting was scheduled, so as not to get lost. She felt that this was already more like an obsession than a search for herself. But any desire to stop was immediately replaced by a sudden interest in the next stranger, in new touches and impressions. Of course, such a lifestyle could not but affect her emotional state. The days of euphoria were followed by periods of decline when she woke up in a cold sweat, feeling that she had gone too far and sooner or later Mark or someone else would figure it out. She understood that she could not lie forever, but it was as if a wound spring pushed her further. A sudden thirst for change devoured her from the inside and left her alone with other people's faces, feelings, names. It is interesting that, with all this, Sarah tried to maintain a picture of well-being. She did not miss social events with her husband, went to work with enthusiasm, and continued to post photos on social networks, showing a happy, successful life. Many friends sincerely believed that everything was going swimmingly for her. At work, they even began to notice that a special confidence emanated from her. After all, during the next intrigues, she stood straight, spoke clearly, as if at any moment she was ready for any surprise. But a heavy ball of guilt was forming inside Sarah, a growing anxiety over the endless deception. Each time after another fleeting affair, she seemed to feel the emptiness more than before. While Sarah plunged into dangerous experiments with unfamiliar partners, Mark focused on business, as he always did. But suddenly, even his stubborn immersion in work could not save him from disturbing thoughts. It began to strike him that Sarah was no longer trying to take care of him, was not asking about his business, was not looking for warmth from him. She acted aloof, and when they happened to be alone in the living room, an oppressive silence hung between them. Sometimes it seemed to Mark that his wife was looking right through him, as if she wasn't seeing him at all. One day, returning from a business meeting a little early, he discovered that Sarah was not at home, although according to the schedule, she should have already finished her work day. Having examined the empty refrigerator and noticing that nothing had been touched since the morning, he experienced a strange feeling, as if he lived alone in this house, and all the memories of the family were an old illusion. Mark, of course, understood that he himself had once brought a lot of problems into their relationship with his constant busyness, but it never occurred to him that Sarah could experience such deep disappointment, and now he didn't know how to approach her. In the evening, finally waiting for Sarah, he tried to start a conversation. "You've been coming late lately. Do you have a new project at the agency?" he asked, trying to make his voice sound friendly. Sarah shrugged her shoulders and said casually, "I work a lot, yes. If we can't see each other, then I'd better get on with things, right?" Mark felt an underlying accusation and coldness in these words. He wanted to object, but could not find an answer. Once upon a time, he could have joked, come up from behind, hugged her, and tried to smooth things over with a sharp word. Now he felt a steel wall, tactile and emotional alienation. At such moments, he could only nod silently, feeling helpless and angry at himself and at her. Gradually, Mark began to look for signs of infidelity. He looked at his wife's phone when she left it on the table, estimated the schedule, and tried to notice something suspicious in the little things. But Sarah acted carefully. There were almost no unnecessary messages, and she received all strange calls in a whisper behind a closed door, when Mark was not around. Both adrenaline and old resentment played in her, so she skillfully disguised her other life. Nevertheless, weak signals, such as other people's numbers, caused Mark more and more anxiety. Plus, the husband's jealousy suddenly worsened. He noticed that his wife began to pay especially close attention to her appearance, buying new dresses and lingerie. Sarah had loved to take care of herself before, but now her grooming went beyond the previous norm, as if she was preparing for a new relationship. Mark could only be tormented by guesses and wonder if he had missed the moments when he could still bring Sarah back. One evening, Mark decided to launch a frontal attack. Arriving home, he literally confronted his wife with a fact. "We have a day off on Saturday. Let's go out of town, just be together, take a walk, have dinner. Maybe this is what we have been missing for a long time." Sarah didn't even turn to look at him as she went to the bathroom. She just said dryly, "I'm busy on Saturday. I had a meeting with a friend. We agreed a long time ago." In fact, she had another secret meeting scheduled, and perhaps more than one, but Sarah was not going to explain anything. Mark, hearing her answer, just silently lowered his shoulders. At that moment, the feeling began to grow in him that he was losing his wife completely, and perhaps it was too late to change anything. At the beginning of summer, a new resident moved into the house opposite Emma, a young artist whose bold paintings had already appeared at local exhibitions. Sarah at that moment was overloaded with personal romances and conflict with her husband, but something in Emma's openness and unique style attracted her attention from the very first meeting. The artist herself approached Sarah as she unloaded bags from the trunk, smiling and asking friendly questions about the area and nearby shops. Emma looked like the embodiment of a creative nature. Short, casually styled reddish hair, an abstract tattoo on her forearm, light multicolored bracelets on her wrists. Her face breathed with a lively interest in the world. Against the backdrop of a dusty, expensive area where people were always rushing about their business, Emma looked like a ray of light, exploding the usual context. "I've only recently been here," Emma explained, looking up from her surroundings. "I'm renting a house for 6 months. I need creative silence, away from the noise of the center. I hope the area is calm." Sarah laughed. "Calm down, yes, but sometimes it's too quiet, to be honest. I'm Sarah, nice to meet you." They exchanged friendly smiles. Within a few days, Emma invited Sarah to a small, housewarming party, promising food and a display of her paintings. Sarah, curious, agreed. She desperately wanted to break out of her usual route: work, secret meetings, quarrels with her husband. Moreover, communication with another woman seemed safe and not burdened with any plans for sex or romance. However, the first meeting in Emma's house amazed Sarah. The artist created amazing canvases, abstract, bold, as if filled with rainbow chaos, and at the same time conveying quiet depth. Pleasant music was playing in the room, and a faint aroma of spicy incense was in the air. There were no loud guests, only a couple of Emma's acquaintances who soon left, leaving them alone. Sarah suddenly felt free, as if she was in a space where no one was evaluating her or expecting anything specific from her. Throughout the evening, they talked about creativity, the importance of listening to your inner voice, psychology, and human soul searching. Emma enthusiastically said that in her paintings she tries to capture the movement of energy. In her opinion, any emotion can be conveyed by color and shape. Sarah listened as if spellbound. It was not at all like the conversations she had with men. There was no rush, aggression, or eroticism in it, but there was some charming spark, a sincere interest in life, which Sarah had been missing for a long time. "It seems to me that you have a lot inside that you want to release," Emma said unexpectedly when they were alone. "I feel some kind of anxiety, but also a great thirst to be myself. I don't know, maybe I'm projecting this." Sarah looked away embarrassed. "Perhaps you're right. Sometimes it seems to me that I am not living my own life. And at some point, I lost my understanding of who I really was." "It's normal," Emma responded softly. "But if you want, you can come to me. Look how I work on my paintings. Sometimes creativity helps to throw out emotions and sort yourself out." Sarah felt that behind such simple words lurked some inexplicable power. She wanted to go back to Emma. On the one hand, it looked like ordinary friendly communication. On the other, intuition suggested that something more, invisible, like a magnet, had already arisen between them. She remembered her connections with men and suddenly wondered, why did she have so much warmth and calm inside when communicating with this artist? In the coming days, Sarah periodically dropped in to see Emma, either for advice or just for tea. They laughed and shared stories. Gradually, their neighborly acquaintance grew into something more confidential. Gradually, more personal topics emerged in their conversations. Emma once admitted that she had a difficult relationship with her parents who did not accept her choice to become an artist, and later condemned her for openly talking about her bisexuality. Sarah, hearing this word, shuddered internally. She had never been intimate with someone who openly admitted to being gay before. But at the same time, she did not experience condemnation, rather curiosity and an incomprehensible warmth, because she felt that Emma was very fragile inside, although she was trying to seem strong. Conversations about sexual orientation inevitably affected Sarah's personal space. She caught Emma's attentive, slightly longer glances. It seemed that the artist was trying to understand something in Sarah to catch subtle signals, and Sarah, unexpectedly for herself, did not feel any discomfort. Moreover, she liked Emma's attention. After many meetings with men, where physical passion or immediate gain prevailed for the most part, Sarah felt a new excitement. There was something subtle, emotionally rich, and at the same time unobtrusive. Gradually, their light touches, a friendly hug, when meeting, or a hand on a shoulder began to take on a different shade. Sarah began to notice how good it felt to have Emma touch her arm or the spot on her back where the fabric of her t-shirt met her skin. And the artist seemed to be checking how Sarah reacted. Sometimes she could gently straighten a strand of hair, tucking it behind her ear, while looking into the eyes a little longer than is customary between friends. Sarah felt her heart begin to beat faster, and every time she asked herself the question, "What am I doing? I've never been interested in women." But the answers came in the form of a smile or another touch that caused a pleasant tingling throughout the body. The first clear hints of flirting arose that evening when Emma, having finished working on the next canvas, asked Sarah to evaluate the painting. She noticed that it depicted abstract figures intertwined in a smooth dance. It seems that this could be interpreted as a symbol of relationships between people. But Sarah intuitively felt that the artist wanted to convey the passion and tenderness of women's bodies. Looking closer, she barely caught details hinting at the outlines of female figures. "Very sensual," Sarah said, feeling a lump in her throat, "and I think I recognize this color scheme. It is similar to your previous works, but here there are more pink and red shades, as if pulsating." Emma smiled. "Yes, I've been writing about love lately, about this aspect of it that does not fit into the standard framework, but at the same time is very natural. I want to express feminine energy." She took Sarah's hand and ran her fingers over the dried paint strokes, barely touching the surface of the canvas. The gesture was so intimate that Sarah took her breath away. She felt a wave of warmth run through her body, wondering where this flash of feelings for the woman came from. But she didn't want to resist. She was fascinated to the depths of her soul by Emma's softness, tact, and inner radiance. With each new meeting, the flirting became more obvious. They were sitting on the couch, watching movies, and Emma would casually lay her head on Sarah's shoulder, wrapping her fingers around her hand. Sarah did not distance herself. On the contrary, she was imbued with this serene unity. It seemed to her that next to Emma, she was throwing off the shell of misunderstanding that had been eating away at her for a long time. And despite the stormy relationships with men, only now she began to suspect that deep down she was looking for something completely different. One day, when Sarah no longer remembered which of them invited the other to visit, they found themselves together again in Emma's house. The evening turned out to be rainy, and the sound of drops on the glass outside the window was heard. Sitting opposite each other, they discussed art and life, sometimes turning to funny jokes, sometimes suddenly freezing in the realization of how closely their thoughts were intertwined. When the power suddenly flickered and went out, Emma lit the candles and the room was filled with a soft, warm light. In this enveloping semi-darkness, they found themselves at a minimum distance from each other. And then something happened between them that they might have been moving towards for a long time. Emma whispered quietly, "Listen, Sarah, I don't want to scare you, but if you feel the same way I do, we don't have to hide it from each other." Instead of answering, Sarah leaned down and touched Emma's lips, as if checking whether she really decided to take this step. The kiss was gentle and careful, completely different from the passionate outbursts with men that Sarah had experienced in recent months. Here, everything seemed to happen in slow motion, immersing you in a warm wave, where there was no place for aggression or fear. Emma responded by holding Sarah close, allowing her to feel the soft trembling of a woman's hands and a body that responded to every breath. Sarah was shaking internally as she realized what was happening. It was the first time she had touched a woman's body in an intimate way, and it excited her senses. There was no comparison to the raw passion or adrenaline she had been living with lately. There was something much subtler and deeper here, as if the hearts were beating in unison. Sarah felt every cell of her skin, as if waking up from a long sleep. And when she and Emma finally dissolved in tenderness, it was an emotional shock unexpectedly for Sarah herself. Tears rolled up to her throat, but not of pain or guilt, but of some kind of quiet, boundless happiness. Soon they moved to a wide couch in the workshop. Emma seemed a little confused by the intensity of the feelings that were coming from Sarah. Nevertheless, she continued to caress her, trying to understand what exactly Sarah needed at that moment. For Sarah herself, a new world of bodily sensations opened up. How a woman's lips can be so soft, how the touch of a woman's fingers sends a subtle shiver down the spine. She suddenly realized that this might be the first real merging of souls, and not just another outburst of passion. When it was all over, they lay next to each other, listening to the rain continuing to beat rhythmically outside the window. Sarah wondered why she didn't feel as guilty or embarrassed as she did after relationships with men. On the contrary, a warm, calm feeling reigned in her. Emma gently ran her fingers through her hair and spoke quietly about how much this meeting meant. For several days, Sarah lived in a state of duality. On the one hand, she secretly met with Emma, drank coffee with her, touched her hand, and looked into her lively, sincere eyes. Each such meeting gave her hope that it was here, within these walls with paintings and clay figurines, that true life reigned. On the other hand, she continued to observe external decency in front of her husband and acquaintances. Sometimes she even contacted men to prove to herself that everything was as before. But these fleeting connections lost their flavor. They were just a meaningless shadow compared to what Sarah found with Emma. Now she thought a lot about her sexual orientation. All her life she felt like she was an ordinary heterosexual woman, simply disappointed in her marriage. But the events of recent months have crushed this confidence. She recalled her school days, when for some reason she was so admired by her beautiful classmates, but then she did not attach any importance to these feelings. At university, her life was completely focused on boys, and then she met Mark. And only now, after so many years, having met Emma, she realized that with a man she had never felt such complete trust, peace, and unity of souls. She was attracted to Emma by tenderness, and it was much more than physical passion. Sarah began to spend restless nights, wondering if she had the strength to make decisive changes, stay married, and lead a parallel life with a woman. But just the thought that she would continue to lie to both Mark and Emma made her feel feverish. On the other hand, should I leave home now? This will entail a scandal, condemnation, and possibly a break in relations with some friends and relatives. She was afraid that Mark might react aggressively or cynically. In moments of despair, she talked with Emma, who convinced her that everyone has the right to decide their own destiny, and that if she feels love for a woman, there is nothing shameful in it. The artist said that she went through the condemnation of her family and friends, but in the end she found peace of mind, living the way she thought was right. Sarah listened and understood that she was afraid not of society's condemnation, but of her own sense of guilt in front of Mark, with whom she had been associated for many years. After all, despite all the resentment and discord, they were once close, and the thought that their marriage could end in such an extraordinary way frightened her. Sarah sat on the floor of Emma's studio, her back leaning against the wall while Emma had her head bowed, working on a colorful painting that she had been unable to complete for weeks. Tubes of paint were scattered everywhere, a blues tune was softly coming from the speakers, and the soft light of the setting sun was breaking through the large window. In this blurry evening light, the colors on the canvas seemed almost alive. You know, Sarah began slowly, fingering her brushes and feeling the cool wooden floor under her feet. Every time I come here, peace comes to my soul. Even if there is a complete rush at work, if there are unresolved problems at home. When I cross the threshold of your workshop, it's as if all this remains outside the door. Emma smiled and, without taking her eyes off the canvas, shook her head slightly. Maybe the point is that you needed a break. You can see for yourself. There are no strict rules or schedules here. I work when I feel inspired. If he's not there, I just sit down to read books or cook. Each of us should have our own corner of freedom. Sarah ran her hand along the wooden floor, remembering the first time she had been in this room several months ago. Then she felt constrained, lonely, exhausted by the fact that her marriage with Mark had long been falling apart at the seams, and numerous affairs on the side did not bring true satisfaction. But meeting Emma changed her entire idea of intimacy and love. Maybe we could make this corner permanent, she said hesitantly, realizing that she had long wanted to ask this question, but was afraid. You were talking about moving to a larger place where we could live together. I think more and more often that I don't want to leave here for that cold house, where essentially nothing is left except furniture and memories. Emma put her brush down, glanced at Sarah, and sat down next to her, crossing her legs. There was a smear of bright red paint on her cheek, which she didn't seem to notice. I can imagine our common space, my workshop, your work area after all. You can easily conduct your marketing online if you want. Besides, we could get a cat, or a dog. Yes, even a parrot. Emma laughed and looked Sarah in the eyes. But Sar, I won't push. I understand that you are technically still married, and until you sort things out with Mark, we'll be stuck in a semi-legal status. I really want to be with you, but I don't want you to continue living a double life. Sarah felt a pang of guilt. Yes, she had been secretly dating Emma for several months, and this relationship was something truly new and intimate for her. But she was still afraid of an open conversation with her husband, realizing that it would shake both him and her world to the core. I know, she said quietly, looking down, and I really don't want to lie anymore. Every time I return home and see Mark, I feel terrible. He already notices that I have completely cooled down. It hurts me to watch him try to get closer, but I just can't. It seems to me that I could never be as sincere with him as I am with you. But you see, I'm afraid. I'm afraid of divorce. I'm afraid of his reaction. I'm afraid that he will make fun of me for leaving for a woman. Emma ran her hand over Sarah's hand, squeezing her fingers slightly. I won't push you to some kind of ultimatum. You just know, I will be there for you no matter what you decide. but it seems to me that time will sort everything out. You yourself will understand when the moment comes to talk to Mark." Late in the evening, Sarah returned to her home. The house greeted her with a darkened corridor and echoing silence. She put on her slippers, walked into the living room, and saw Mark. He was sitting on the sofa, surrounded by a pile of papers. There was an unfinished glass of wine on the table in front of him. "Hello," Sarah said quietly, throwing her bag on the chair. "Have you had dinner yet?" "Yes," Mark answered briefly. He put the papers aside and looked at his wife with a tired look. "There's something left in the oven if you want, but it has already cooled down." Sarah nodded, feeling the usual pang of awkwardness. Over the past months, their house had turned into a hotel. She came late. He, too, was almost always busy. Conversations boiled down to a businesslike "hello" and "how was your day?" Today, however, there was a note in Mark's voice that Sarah could not ignore, a note of resentment and, perhaps, growing irritation. She moved to the kitchen table and opened the oven, but her hunger suddenly disappeared. She silently looked at the cold-baked chicken for a couple of seconds and suddenly realized that she did not want to put off the inevitable any longer. She slammed the oven door and returned to the living room, where Mark was already buried in papers again. "Mark," Sarah began quietly, peering into his face, "can I see you for a minute?" He leaned back on the sofa, clearly not in the best mood. "Yes, sure. What's happened?" Sarah rubbed her temples, trying to collect her thoughts. "Wasn't it too early for me to make up my mind?" flashed through her head. But she felt internally that she could no longer live in constrained silence. "I need to talk to you. This is serious." Mark frowned and put the papers aside. "I'm listening. I also have a couple of questions for you, but speak first." Sarah wanted to immediately announce that she fell in love with a woman, but she decided to start from afar. "I know that we have hardly communicated in recent months. I come late, and so do you. I got the feeling that we were no longer a family, but cohabitants. And I don't feel at all that we understand each other." "A long time ago" is putting it mildly. Mark grinned. There was bitterness in his voice. "To be honest, I'm already used to the fact that there are two strangers in the house. But apparently you want to say something specific." Sarah clasped her hands in her lap, trying to stop shaking. "Yes, a few months ago, I realized that I lack warmth, and I was looking for this in relationships on the side." Mark tensed, but did not interrupt. He was clearly waiting for the continuation, and some strange light flashed in his eyes, as if he was ready for a confession in advance. "At first I tried to find in these men something that we haven't had for a long time," Sarah continued. "But everything turned out to be wrong. And then Emma appeared in my life, and I fell in love with her, Mark. I want to be with her, and I'm tired of lying. I like girls." He silently looked from Sarah to the stack of documents, as if pondering her words. There was a long pause filled with heavy silence. Sarah felt her mouth dry and her heart pounding so loudly that it echoed in her ears. It seemed to her that now he would get up and make a scandal, start shouting or reproaching. But Mark suddenly sighed barely audibly. "I knew you were cheating on me," he finally said, "but I didn't think it was about a woman. Okay, for some reason this is even logical, considering everything that happened to us." He leaned forward a little. "Are you sure this is not just some kind of experiment? What do you really want to leave?" Sarah felt slightly bewildered. Her husband's reaction was much calmer than she had expected. This did not make it easier for her, but, on the contrary, even worse. "I feel truly happy with Emma. With her, I can be myself. And yes, I don't want to continue a marriage in which we are both unhappy." "We're both unhappy," Mark asked with a sad smile. "You have no idea how true this is." He ran his hand through his hair, as if he didn't know how to find the words. Sarah sat opposite, mentally preparing herself for shouts and reproaches, but none of them followed. Finally, Mark spoke again. "If you think that only you have secrets, then you are mistaken. I've been having an affair for a long time with my business partner, Ellie. I think it started about 9 months ago, maybe a little more. At first, there was purely business communication. We built a foundation, opened a branch. But then everything somehow crossed the line. With her, I feel like I'm living and not just working for days. And paradoxically, I'm also tired of lying. Sarah, hearing this, tensed up as if she had been punched in the stomach. It became funny and sad at the same time. It turns out that they both kept their relationship a secret. Lord, she said quietly, covering her face with her palm, that is, we didn't talk about all this at all, but we're busy, each with our own lives. How much time did we waste like this? Mark got up from the sofa and took a couple of steps around the room. A shadow of regret crossed his face. I don't know how much, but it's definitely too much. If you want to go to your Emma, I won't make a scene. Moreover, I also no longer see the point of living, pretending to be a happy couple. We can divorce calmly if that's what you want. Sarah nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. Everything happened much faster and not as she expected. There were no loud accusations, no scenes of jealousy. On the contrary. There was some kind of bottomless devastation and the realization that their marriage had long been a formality. She said quietly, I'm sorry if I hurt you. I'm scared to imagine how we will continue to exist, but... Mark stopped opposite, crossing his arms over his chest. You know, Sar, to be honest, I've long been unaccustomed to the idea of we. There is you and I, and there is a wall between us. I think we both pretended to have everything under control because we were afraid of ruining everything. But there was nothing alive left here. He fell silent for a moment, then shrugged. Let's just agree without squabbles and division of property in the spirit of a legal thriller. We are adults, and everyone has the right to happiness. As for the pain, yes, it will be painful and unusual. But, maybe we can even maintain something like friendship if we try. Sarah couldn't believe it all sounded so calm. She expected a storm, but received a quiet acknowledgement that their paths were diverging. It was discouraging, but also a strange relief. She wanted to hug her husband, but she understood that this was a gesture from another time. Okay, she said, I don't want to start hostilities either. So it's better to discuss the details later, right? Yes, Mark sighed and removed the papers from the table. Right now, I'm too tired to discuss finances and home. But yes, let's solve everything humanly. At this point, their conversation died down. Sarah felt her legs shaking and excused herself and went to her bedroom. The next day, the house seemed even more empty and lifeless. Mark, who usually left early, stayed late today. Apparently, he did not want to give Sarah false reasons for illusions. He invited her to have coffee in the kitchen before she went to work. How was your night? He asked, placing the cup in front of her. To be honest, I hardly slept by myself. We hid so much from each other. Yes, I tossed and turned too, Sarah admitted, and I constantly thought about how everything would be now. It's important for me to tell you. I don't want to take everything from you or even ruin your business. I would like to reach an agreement peacefully so that everyone can continue to live their lives. Well, I don't have many plans, but I know I want to try living with Emma. Mark handed her the sugar bowl, and Sarah noticed that his hands were shaking slightly. Listen, I'm sure we can part ways more or less calmly. I'm not going to do anything bad to you either. Since everything turned out this way, it means it's time to let each other go. Thank you, Sarah sighed, looking at the coffee. I think in the next few days I need to pluck up the courage to tell my family about this. I can't imagine how they will react with a woman. Understand, I myself don't know how to explain everything to my parents, much less to my colleagues at the foundation. They are used to seeing us as an exemplary family. But, it seems to me that sooner or later those around me won't care. Everyone has their own life. Sarah smiled at the corner of her lips, realizing that she had not felt such warmth for Mark for a long time as she did now, when they had already decided to break up. Perhaps their general honesty dispelled the muted hostility. Then Mark's phone rang in the silence. He looked at the screen, winced, and replied, Ellie, hi. No, not on time. Yes, I'm home. Look, I'll call you back as soon as I get out. Okay, sorry. He hung up the call and put the phone aside. Sorry, this is her. Sarah held her breath, realizing that this woman was to him what Emma had become to her. But she didn't feel jealous. Rather, curiosity and understanding. Both of them found someone who turned out to be more important than an illusory family that had long been deprived of warmth. Do you love her? She asked quietly, although she wasn't sure whether she should ask such a question. Mark frowned and rubbed his neck. To be honest, I don't know how much love this is, but it's easy for me. She understands me and supports me in business. For the first time, I felt like I could talk about myself and not just my work. You know, the irony is that at the same time you and I realized that there was no spiritual intimacy left in the marriage. Sarah placed her hand on the table, wondering if their situations were more similar than they seemed. She smiled bitterly. Yes, indeed. This is probably what happens when people distance themselves, but don't dare say it out loud. Mark took a sip of coffee. Let's look forward. When is the best time for you to discuss everything about finances and the house? We can do it in the evening, if you don't mind. Certainly. And thank you for not causing a scandal. I was really afraid of this. And I was afraid that you would scream and accuse me of betrayal. But it seems that we both managed to survive all the complaints somewhere inside, while we were silent. This is probably why it happened without thunder and lightning. When Sarah, having finished her work in the office, returned to Emma's workshop in the evening, her heart was beating faster than usual. She prepared news for Emma that she had not even dared to dream of the day before. Everything that they had been working towards for several months was now beginning to come true. Emma changed the music to a calmer one when she saw Sarah on the threshold and approached her with a smile. Hello? You're early today. Everything is fine. Partly. I talked to Mark, Sarah breathed, looking straight into Emma's warm eyes. He also admitted that he has had someone else for a long time. We decided to get a divorce. Emma was confused. Wow. To be honest, I expected you to have a war. How are you? Sarah lowered her shoulders as if shedding a long-standing burden. I feel empty and free at the same time. I didn't think that he would take my confession so calmly. We haven't discussed the details, but it looks like everything will go through without legal battles. She took a step towards Emma and took her hands in hers. Listen, I understand that I have to talk with my family, with mutual friends, but I want to be with you. Open. I'm tired of lying. Emma smiled, and sparkles of joy sparkled in her eyes. You can't even imagine how happy I am to hear this. I was so afraid that you would have to retreat or that Mark would give you hell. But it turns out that everything is more or less peaceful. Yes, more or less. Although I feel like I was in the epicenter of a hurricane, Sarah admitted. But now I want to look at our life. On us, did you say something about moving? Tell me everything again. They sat down on the sofa, where some kind of fabric with sketches was laid out on top of the pillows. Emma cheerfully threw all this aside. I said that in a couple of months the lease for this workshop would end, and I was looking at a house with a large attic space for a studio. You can arrange everything perfectly there. If you're ready, we can live there together. Of course, you will have to invest something, but... I have savings, Sarah interrupted her. Mark, I think he won't mind if I take some of the money from our joint account. Besides, I want to be a partner in your creative work. Perhaps we can make not just a workshop, but something like a small gallery. You've been dreaming about this for a long time. Emma smiled widely, not hiding her delight. Seriously, are you ready to invest so that we can have our own gallery? I thought this was such an ephemeral dream. Why not? I'm a marketer. I could promote your works, and not only yours. We could hold exhibitions of emerging artists and musical evenings there. Can you imagine? Emma literally jumped up on the couch and pulled Sarah into a joyful hug. That sounds amazing. I am ready for any experiments as long as we can create and live together without looking back at conventions. Oh, Sar, but are you sure? These are big changes. Sarah, feeling the warmth from the touches, smiled through the light tears that naturally welled up in her eyes. I'm sure that's what I want. With you. The rest is details. The evening coolness penetrated through the slightly open window of the living room. Sarah sat in an easy chair, watching the last rays of sunset slide across the walls, painting them in warm shades of orange and gold. An unusual silence reigned in this half-empty house. Most of the furniture had already been taken out or sold. Boxes of things were waiting in the corner of the corridor. Soon the remains of their life together will be dispersed. Some will go to Sarah, some to Mark. The rest will go to storage or end up in the hands of new owners. There have been a lot of emotional conversations here over the last week. Once this house was a symbol of their well-being, but lately it has looked more and more like a set for a play that played out until the finale. Sarah looked at the reflections of the sun's glare and experienced a strange feeling of relief, mixed with soft sadness. Everything had already been decided, but the memories, even painful ones, remained a part of her life. Soon footsteps were heard in the corridor. It was Mark who returned. He quietly walked into the living room, holding a folder with documents and some papers. Sarah could see that his hands were shaking slightly, although his gaze remained calm. "Hello," he said quietly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile silence. "Hi," Sarah responded, glancing at the stack of documents. "Did everything go well? Have you met with a lawyer?" "Yes, we signed some final papers. There are a couple of copies here. I need you to look through it, and if everything is in order, sign it." Mark carefully placed the folder on the low coffee table. "It seems that formally we are already at the finish line." Sarah nodded, trying to gather her will. It seemed that she had already worked out this step 100 times in her head, but when everything was nearing completion, a bitter lump arose inside her. It seemed that the tired soul was asking to evaluate once again whether everything had been decided correctly. "I'll look at the documents a little later," she said calmly. "I wanted to talk to you before we finalize the divorce, so that we both clearly understand how we will communicate further." Mark sat down on the sofa, straightening his back slightly. "Certainly. I also wanted to discuss something. In recent days, I feel that there is some kind of mutual understanding between us, but we have not talked everything through to the end. And yet," he glanced quickly at Sarah, "I need to tell you one important news that concerns my future." Sarah's heart sank. She guessed that the news was connected with her business partner, Ellie, who had been in Mark's life for a long time, although he hid it for a long time. However, in recent weeks, she and Mark have already overcome all the main reproaches and grievances. He knew about Sarah's relationship with Emma, and she knew about his affair with Ellie. Both decided to go their own way, realizing that they lived together only out of fear of change. She leaned back in her chair, trying to keep her breathing even. "Tell me, I'm ready to listen." Mark ran his hand through his hair. It was clear that the news worried him to the core, but he was trying to control himself. "Ellie is pregnant," he finally said, after a short pause. "I found out about this just a few days ago. To be honest, at first it shocked me we weren't planning a child right now. But then, when she confirmed it and the doctor confirmed it, He stopped short, as if afraid to show joy too soon, and looked at Sarah. However, he saw no hostility or envy in her eyes, just quiet surprise and sympathy. "I realized that I really want to become a father," Mark continued, looking at his hands. "It seems to me that this can give me the meaningfulness that I have long been looking for, not only in work, but in everything in general. I'm happy." Sarah was silent, digesting what she heard. Conflicting feelings arose in her chest. On the one hand, the knowledge that her husband would soon have a child with another woman was a kind of symbolic end to the previous period of life. On the other hand, she wanted to sincerely wish him happiness. "This is unexpected," she finally said, trying to find the right words. "But I'm glad you feel happy. How many years we lived together and we didn't have children. Maybe because deep down we were never sure that we were ready for them. And if now you say that this gave you meaning, then I sincerely wish that everything turned out as best as possible, both for Ellie and for you." Mark breathed a sigh of relief. "Thank you. I was afraid that you might take this as a betrayal or as a reproach for not having children. But since everything is like this, he was silent for a moment and then added, True, Ellie and I don't plan to rush into marriage yet. There's too much to sort out. But I know for sure that I will support her and the child. And since you and I are finally leaving the marriage, I can build my life more openly. Sarah nodded, taking all the new circumstances into account. It is curious that she felt a kind of relief. Now Mark certainly has his own future and his own goal, which means that their past will not be a stone behind him. You see, she replied, over the past months I've also been thinking about what we could have. But now I realize that perhaps we made the right choice by not deciding on a child when we ourselves had not yet figured out our relationship. And now, let everything go as it should. I'm not going to fight with you. Mark looked at her with quiet gratitude. Glad to hear that. And you? How are things going with Emma? Are you also planning something? Sarah felt a wave of warm feelings cover her inside when talking about Emma. She is now looking for a place for a new workshop to combine creativity with a gallery. I want to help her with the marketing side. Maybe we'll even rent a place together next to the studio. I don't know. For now, these are more sketches than a real plan. But I feel that we are ready to take a step forward. I understand, Mark nodded. It seems that each of us eventually found someone with whom we want to be completely honest. And maybe it was time for us to part a long time ago. You know, I sometimes remember what we were like when we got married. Was it true love or just a convenient coincidence of ambition? Then it seemed to me that I loved you, Sarah said honestly, placing her palm on the armrest of the chair. But perhaps we only loved images of each other and not real personalities. Because when life moved on, it turned out that our paths were too different. Sarah stood up and turned on the floor lamp to make the room a little brighter. Mark also stood up and looked at the stack of documents on the table. It seemed that the moment itself was calling them to complete the formalities, but they both did not want to turn this into a dry legal procedure. Listen, Sarah said quietly, motioning for her husband to sit down next to her. This may seem strange to some, but let's just talk like friends. No complaints. After all, we share more than just a house, money, and things. We share a common memory. Mark agreed, sat down on the sofa, and Sarah sat next to him. There was a short distance between them, but the atmosphere no longer resembled a conversation between embittered exes. On the contrary, it felt like they had finally let each other go. I know we've both made mistakes in the past, Sarah began. I ran away into random relationships instead of having an honest conversation. You also became distant, completely immersed in work, and did not notice my needs. But I don't want to be blamed. I want to understand how we got to this point and why we stayed together for so many years if everything was heading towards a breakup. Mark shook his head, remembering all their scandals and peaceful periods. You know, it seems to me that at the beginning we sincerely wanted to be together. I liked that you were ambitious, that you were lively and energetic. You liked that I was serious and knew how to achieve goals. But then these same qualities began to separate us. I went deeper into my career, and you felt like you weren't being heard. And it turned out that we simply stopped understanding what was important to each other. That's probably true, Sarah agreed. But I can't blame you alone for everything. For too long, I was afraid to say that I was missing something. I thought that I could handle it myself. And when I started having affairs, I no longer understood why I was doing all this. Either I wanted to regain the feeling of youth, or I was just looking for solace from loneliness. Mark sighed, running his hand over the cover of the folder. And to be honest, I thought that I would find answers to all my questions in my work. Reports, deals, investments, partly it was an escape. Then Ellie was nearby, listening to me, helping me with business, and imperceptibly we became closer than I expected. Only then did I realize how far I was from you. They met their gaze for a moment. Sadness flashed in the eyes of both, but no longer painful and sharp, but soft, turning into peace. You see, Sarah said calmly, I don't want our divorce to be a reason for scandals. We have both come a long way, and I want to thank you for the moments when we were happy. Yes, it's all over now, but maybe we should part with good memories. I think so too, Mark nodded and smiled slightly. After all, if we had parted earlier, perhaps we would not have had time to gain the very experiences and feelings that led us to our real partners. I'm glad we can sit down and talk calmly. Sarah took the folder with documents and flipped through a few pages. Everything was pretty standard. An extract about the division of property, an agreement not to make property claims against each other. It was decided to put the house up for sale and divide the proceeds equally. They had already divided several bank accounts. Mark needed more funds to expand his business, and Sarah, accordingly, needed part of the money to open a gallery with Emma. The only question that remained was, where should Sarah move? I'm moving in the next week, she said, checking the dates. I don't need a big car. I have already either sold or donated most of the things. Moreover, you will also need the space if Ellie comes here. Mark corrected Sarah with a slight smile. Actually, Ellie and I don't plan to live here. This house is too big, and it is connected with our memories. I was thinking about selling it and moving closer to the office. After all, when the child appears, traveling from this area will become inconvenient. Too long to get there. So if you don't care, we sell the house completely and split the money equally. Great, Sarah nodded. Then I'll literally release everything that's left in a day or two. And it will be possible to put the house on the market. Do you mind if I take some dishes as souvenirs? It's not that I really need it, but it's like a small detail with which moments are connected. Of course, take it. I don't mind. Just leave me my favorite coffee service. Consider it already part of the collection, Mark remarked a little more cheerfully. Both smiled slightly, realizing that such everyday details seemed funny and important at the same time. The final formalities decided the fate of their marriage and the house in which they lived. Speaking of the future, Mark said when they agreed on the sale, "You mentioned the gallery. Can you tell me more?" Sarah hesitated. She was not yet used to being able to speak enthusiastically about her project in front of her ex-husband. But I decided to be frank. Emma paints pictures, but wants to invite other artists. We were thinking of renting space in one creative cluster, where there are studios, coffee shops, and event spaces. I will help with advertising, promotion on social networks, and communication with sponsors. Maybe we'll even set up a hipster cafe there. The main idea is to create a place where people can feel creative freedom. Sounds cocky, Mark admitted. But if everything goes well, this could become a successful business. If you need investments, I can help with advice. He said this without any irony, rather with professional interest. True, I won't become an investor, so as not to disturb your atmosphere, he added half-jokingly. When everything was agreed upon with the documents, Mark and Sarah moved on to the next stage signing. They took pens, signed where necessary, and sealed everything with dates. Officially, their divorce was almost completed, only final visits to lawyers and government agencies remained. That's all, Mark exhaled, leaning back on the sofa. It seemed that the road would be more thorny, but we managed. Yes, probably the main crisis passed earlier, Sarah answered quietly. She looked at her husband, or rather, her ex-husband, and her eyes reflected a mixture of sadness and gratitude. You know, we lived together for a significant period of our lives, and I want to say, thank you for the good moments we had. Thank you too, he responded, moving closer to Sarah. I'm sorry it's over, but since it's the way it is, I'm glad we can leave as friends. He tentatively extended his hand, as if inviting Sarah to a farewell hug. She hesitated a little, but still accepted the invitation. They embraced on the sofa, and in this gesture there was no passion or desire to return to the past, only a quiet feeling of mutual forgiveness. Sarah rested her forehead on his shoulder, and Mark closed his eyes, as if remembering the best moments of their union. I'll miss our travels together, Sarah muttered. Do you remember how we went to Italy the year before and drank wine near Lake Como? I remember, Mark responded with a slight smile. And as you said, we will someday buy a house on the beach and spend every summer there. It's a pity that we didn't have time to come to this. Well, maybe someday. You and Ellie will go there, and I will go with Emma. And we'll just be neighbors across the lake, who knows? Sarah joked, although deep down she understood that it was unlikely that they would organize it that way. But there was some truth in this joke. You never guess where and how new paths will cross. They sat like that for another minute, hugging each other, and then slowly pulled away. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but not tears of pain, but tears of liberation. She wiped them decisively with the back of her hand. Okay, it's time to go. I have to get up early tomorrow and need to finish packing. And you probably have a lot of things to do, she said, realizing that this day had become one of the most important in her life. Yes, I need to take care of the house, put it up for sale, and maybe I'll soon look for new housing closer to the center. Ellie, by the way, asked me to tell you that if we ran into each other by chance, she wouldn't mind talking. But of course, this is if you want it yourself. Sarah shrugged. I don't know, I need time to get used to it. But probably, why not? If you raise a child together, I don't want there to be any hostile feelings between us. In the end, we all made choices that set us free. Mark stood up, helped Sarah off the couch, and walked her to the door. On the threshold, they once again exchanged a short glance. There was no former love affection in it, only a quiet kinship of people who know too much about each other. Call me if you suddenly need any formalities or help with moving, Mark suggested, opening the door. Thank you, definitely, Sarah nodded. Take care of yourself. And take care of the expectant mother. Let her know that I sincerely wish you happiness. I'll tell her everything, Mark answered, and a smile played at the corners of his lips. And you will be happy with Emma. I hope to invite you to our housewarming party someday, or you can come to the opening of the gallery. A deep blue twilight fell on the street. Sarah decided to walk to the parking lot. She needed a few minutes to calm her feelings. My breathing became calmer and my heart became lighter. It was as if the huge rock she had been carrying around in her soul for years had finally been lifted. She remembered Emma's face, her warm hands, her laughter that could drive away any anxiety. They had a difficult path ahead, renting premises, searching for investments, and everyday worries. But now Sarah knew that there was a person nearby who would not force her to hide and adapt to other people's expectations. She herself can be sincere and free. When Sarah reached her car, she stopped, looking at the sky, where the stars were barely visible. The image of a smiling Mark popped into my head, saying that he would soon become a father. A strange joy for him and a quiet feeling of the correctness of the situation overwhelmed Sarah. Despite all the suffering, scandals, fleeting hobbies, and grievances that happened in the past, now everything ended peacefully and meaningfully. She got into the car and took out her phone. She wanted to call Emma and share the results of the evening. But before dialing the number, Sarah thought it would be nice to first enjoy a short silence and allow herself to feel everything to the end. We are divorcing as friends, she repeated to herself, surprised at the soft sound of these words. She once thought that divorce was always painful and humiliating. But their story proved that people can break up and maintain respect. The main thing is to sincerely admit to each other your own weaknesses, not to place blame on only one side, and most importantly, to realize that love should not turn into a prison. Sarah turned the key in the ignition, and a calm melody from the radio station began to play in the cabin. She smiled at her thoughts, estimating that she had a lot of work ahead of her. Tomorrow I'll pack my things, call the realtor, and in the evening I'll meet with Emma and discuss plans for the gallery. Or maybe we'll have a little celebration in honor of the new life. With this warm thought, she drove out of the yard, leaving behind her the house where important years of her life had passed. But there was no bitterness, only quiet relief and humility. Everything was going as usual, and there was a whole chapter ahead that she was ready to write again. And maybe someday, years from now, she will meet Mark at some family function, and they will both look at each other with a smile, knowing that they made the right choice in letting each other go. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.